In the gilded summer of 1941, the German war machine, the Wehrmacht, seemed less an army and more a force of nature. It had consumed Poland in weeks, humbled France in a month, and now it poured across the vast plains of the Soviet Union in an unstoppable tide of steel and fire. The doctrine of blitzkrieg, a symphony of panzers, Stukas, and motorized infantry, had been perfected into an art form. At the heart of this storm were the Panzerkampfwagen III and IV, seen by their crews and designers as the zenith of armored vehicle engineering. They were sophisticated, reliable machines, crewed by the best-trained men in the world. Their 5 cm and short-barreled 7.5 cm guns had proven more than a match for anything the West could field. The prevailing sentiment from the highest echelons of the Oberkommando des Heeres, OKH, down to the common lancer, was one of invincibility. The intelligence reports on Soviet armor were dismissive, painting a picture of a poorly led, technologically backward force, equipped with masses of obsolete light tanks like the BT-7 and T-26. These were expected to be swept aside with contemptuous ease. And for the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, this assessment held true. German newsreels, projected to rapt audiences in Berlin and Munich, showed endless columns of burning Soviet tanks, their turrets blown clean off, testament to the superiority of German steel and German will. Letters from the front spoke of Turkey shoots, of Soviet crews panicking and abandoning their flimsy vehicles at the first sign of a panzer. And then, in early July, near the town of Orsha, the whispers began. They started not as official reports, but as frantic, often disbelieved chatter over crackling field radios. A panzer grenadier from the 17th Panzer Division wrote a letter home, later censored but preserved in divisional archives. We engaged their tanks. Our 37 anti-tank guns, the ones that worked so well in France, just bounced off. The shells sparked against their armor like pebbles. They did not slow. They simply rolled over our gun positions, over our men. We have never seen anything like this. The whispers coalesced into a name, a designation spoken with a new and unfamiliar tone of dread: T-34. Soon, the anecdotes became tactical realities. In one infamous engagement, a single T-34 was reported to have held up an entire Kampfgruppe of the 6th Panzer Division for a full day, shrugging off dozens of direct hits from 15 tank guns before finally being knocked out by a point-blank shot from a hidden 88 flak gun. The myth of German invincibility began to crack. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg himself, noted in his war diary with stark alarm, "This is the first time a tank has appeared that is qualitatively superior to our own. The T-34, with its good armor, ideal shape, and magnificent 76.2 long-barreled gun, is a source of great concern. And the T-34 was more than a machine. It was a psychological weapon. Its silhouette, low and predatory with radically sloped armor, was alien. Unlike the tall, boxy, and somehow formal panzers, that looked brutish, functional, and utterly devoid of engineering vanity. It moved with a startling speed across the broken terrain, its wide tracks churning through the mud and dust that bogged down German vehicles. Its gun, a high-velocity 76.2 cannon, could kill a Panzer IV from 1,000 meters, a range at which the Panzer's own gun was useless. The soldiers dubbed this phenomenon Panzerschreck, tank fright. The legend of the T-34 grew with every engagement, amplified by fear and rumor. It was said to be unstoppable, its armor impenetrable, its presence a guarantee of death. The contrast between the propaganda of the subhuman Bolshevik hordes and the chilling effectiveness of their premier fighting machine was a cognitive dissonance that rattled the German command structure. They had expected masses of inferior equipment, and they had found that. But hidden within the horde was this monster. It wasn't just better in one area, it seemed to defy the accepted logic of tank design. It was fast, heavily armed, and heavily armored, a combination that, according to German engineering principles, should have been impossible to achieve in a medium tank. The initial German assessment was that these must be limited-run prototypes, anomalies that would soon disappear. But they did not disappear. They appeared in greater and greater numbers. The mystery of the T-34 became a strategic obsession. How did they build it? What alloys were they using? What design philosophy allowed for such a balance of characteristics? Simple battlefield autopsies of destroyed vehicles were insufficient. The intense fires often ruined the metallurgy, and the catastrophic damage obscured the subtleties of the design. A single, overriding directive was issued from the Waffenamt, the Army Weapons Agency in Berlin, and cascaded down through the chain of command to every unit on the vast Eastern Front. Capture one. Capture one intact. It was no longer just a tactical objective, it was a strategic necessity. To defeat the beast, they first had to understand it. The opportunity came in late September 1941 in the marshy, unforgiving terrain south of Smolensk. A T-34 model 1941, part of a failed Soviet counterattack, had thrown a track and bellied out in a deep peat bog. Its crew, harassed by German infantry and unable to recover their vehicle, had abandoned it after a brief firefight, leaving it mired up to its sponsons in the black, acidic water. It was a perfect prize. A special recovery unit from the 20th Panzer Division worked for 2 days under the constant threat of partisan attack, laying down a corduroy road of logs to bring in their heavy FAMO recovery tractors. The air was thick with the drone of mosquitoes and the stench of decay. Finally, with the shriek of tortured steel and the roar of 3 engines, the mud reluctantly released its captive. The T-34, caked in black earth and trailing weeds, was dragged onto solid ground. It looked less like a machine and more like something dredged from a primeval swamp. Within a week, it was loaded onto a reinforced flat car, covered in a massive tarpaulin, and began its slow, high-priority journey west, across Poland and into the heart of the Reich. Its destination, the Heeresversuchsanstalt Kummersdorf, the Wehrmacht's secret weapon-proving ground south of Berlin. /N in a cavernous, cathedral-like workshop at Kummersdorf, smelling of cold steel, cutting oil and ozone from the welding torches, the team assembled. They were the finest minds the Waffenamt could muster. Leading them was Dr. Ingenieur Klaus Adler, a man in his late 40s with thinning hair and hands permanently stained with graphite and grease. Adler was a pragmatist, a systems thinker who saw machines not as isolated objects, but as solutions to strategic problems. With him was Hauptmann Erich Richter, the ballistics and armor specialist. A professional soldier with an engineer's degree, Richter was a man who believed implicitly in the superiority of Krupp steel and the clean, vertical lines of German armor plate. He viewed the T-34 with a skeptical scowl. Representing the pinnacle of German engine design was the young, brilliant, and insufferably arrogant Oberleutnant Franz Bauer from Maybach. For Bauer, the engine was not just a power source. It was the soul of a vehicle, and he could not conceive of a soul more refined than the V12 gasoline engines that powered the Panzers. Finally, there was the quiet, almost invisible Dr. Heinrich Metz, a metallurgist who communicated more with his calipers and spectrographs than with words. His job was to decipher the enemy's recipes for steel. /N, the tarpaulin was pulled back. The 4 men stood in silence for a long moment, circling the machine. Their first sensory impressions were jarring. The smell was the first thing Adler noticed, not just the swamp mud, but a pungent, agricultural odor of cheap paint, raw diesel fuel, and something else, a faint, coppery scent of human sweat and fear. Richter ran a gloved hand along the turret. "The casting is atrocious," he muttered, pointing to visible pits and seams. "A child could do better work." He tapped the frontal glacis plate with a small steel hammer. The sound was a dull, heavy thud, a sound that seemed to absorb energy rather than reflect it. It was an unsettling sound. Bauer, meanwhile, was examining the external welds joining the hull plates. "Look at this," he said with a dismissive wave. "It's slaggy, uneven. In our factories, the foreman would have the welder flogged for work like this." Their initial hypotheses began to form, colored by a century of German engineering culture. To them, quality was synonymous with precision, fine tolerances, and a perfect finish. What stood before them was the antithesis of that philosophy. It looked crude, hurried, almost agricultural. It looked, they initially concluded, like something built by peasants. /N/N Adler, however, remained silent. He hoisted himself up onto the hull and peered down the driver's hatch. He shone a torch inside. The interior was brutally Spartan. Bare metal painted a simple off-white was everywhere. The driver's levers were massive, simple steel bars. The ammunition was stored in simple metal boxes on the floor. There was no turret basket. The commander and loader had to stand on the ammunition boxes, shuffling around the gun breech as the turret traversed. The ergonomics were a nightmare. How could anyone fight effectively in this? Richter wondered aloud. Adler didn't answer. He was looking at the way the massive armor plates were joined, the sheer size of the components. He saw not just crude welding, but a design that actively facilitated it, a design that didn't require the master craftsmen who were becoming so scarce in Germany's total war economy. His initial hypothesis was different from the others. He suspected they were not looking at incompetence. They were looking at a different kind of competence, a different philosophy of war, rendered in steel. The analysis began in earnest on the firing ranges of Kummersdorf, a vast, sandy expanse scarred by decades of ordnance testing. Hauptmann Richter was in his element here. This was a world of clean physics, of measurable velocities and penetration depths. The T-34 was positioned 500 meters downrange, its formidable 60-degree sloped frontal glacis plate aimed squarely at the firing line. Richter's confidence was palpable. He believed the tank's reputation was a product of battlefield panic and anecdotal exaggeration. Now, under controlled conditions, the science of ballistics would expose the myth. /N/N The first gun to be tested was the 3.7 cm Paquet 36, the standard light anti-tank gun of the German infantry. It was a weapon that had served them well in Poland and France, nicknamed the Heeresangriffgerät, the army's door knocker for its sharp report. The gun crew, precise and drilled, loaded a Panzer granate 39, an armor-piercing capped projectile. The command was given. The gun barked, a sharp, clean crack. Through high-powered binoculars, Adler and his team watched the tracer arc towards the target. The impact was not the satisfying clang of penetration they expected. Instead, there was a brilliant white flash and a high-pitched metallic scream. The shell, striking the highly sloped plate, simply shattered, its kinetic energy deflected harmlessly into the sky. A long white scar on the dark green paint was the only result. They fired again, same result, and again. The crew fired a full dozen rounds, and not a single one did more than chip the paint. Richter's confident expression began to harden into a frown. /N/N Bring up the 5 centimeter, he commanded. A Panzer III, its engine rumbling smoothly, was maneuvered into position. Its 5 cm KWK 38L42 was the main armament of Germany's primary battle tank. It was a respected, accurate weapon. The gunner took aim, the commander gave the order, and the Panzer rocked on its suspension as the gun fired. The heavier shell flew true. This time, the impact was more substantial. A shower of orange sparks erupted from the glacis plate, and the sound was a deafening, resonant gong that echoed across the range. When they examined the impact point, they found a deeper gouge in the steel, but still no penetration. The shell had been deflected, tumbling away into the sand. They fired again, this time with the newer, tungsten-cored Panzer Granate 40. This was the Reich's ace in the hole, a high-velocity, sub-caliber round capable of piercing the thickest Allied armor. The impact was violent, a miniature explosion of light and sound. But again, the result was the same. The incredible slope of the armor had defeated Germany's best tank-killing ammunition. Richter was speechless. /N/N Back in the workshop, Adler drew a diagram on a large chalkboard, explaining the physics to his stunned colleagues. "It is a matter of trigonometry," he explained, his voice calm, academic. "Our design philosophy and that of the French and British has been to increase armor thickness. We present a flat 100 mm plate to the enemy. It is strong but straightforward. The Russians have been more clever. This front plate, he tapped a set of calipers against the T-34's hull, is only 45 millimeters thick. By our standards, it is paper. But by sloping it at 60 degrees from the vertical, they have changed the equation. An incoming shell does not see 45 millimeters. It sees a line-of-sight thickness of 90 millimeters. He sketched the vectors. But it is more than that. The angle of incidence is so extreme that the shell's piercing cap cannot gain purchase. Instead of digging in, it is pushed upwards. Most of its energy is spent deflecting it. It is a judo throw in steel. It uses our own shell's velocity against itself. /n/n doctor. Metz then presented the initial findings from his metallurgical analysis. He had cut a core sample from a less critical armor plate. Under the microscope, the steel's grain structure was unremarkable. It is a homogeneous rolled nickel-chromoly steel, he reported, his voice betraying a hint of disappointment. The hardening is decent, but the quality control is variable. There are impurities. Compared to our chrome-molybdenum face-hardened plates, the base material is not superior. In fact, in some ways, it is inferior. Bauer, the engine man, scoffed. So it's just cheap steel then? No, Metz countered softly. That is the genius of it. Our armor is a complex sandwich of hardened and ductile layers. It is difficult to manufacture, and more importantly, it can become brittle and spall on the interior when struck, even without full penetration. This Russian steel is simpler, more ductile. It is designed to be tough, not brittle. And when combined with this radical sloping, it creates a total protective system that is far greater than the sum of its parts. They did not need superior steel, because they had a superior geometry. /n/n This was the first great shock of the Kummersdorf analysis. It was a fundamental challenge to German orthodoxy. German design prized the quality of the material. Krupp and Skoda produced the finest armor plate in the world, and German tanks were essentially armored boxes built from this exquisite material. The designers had sidestepped the problem entirely. They had used a simpler, easier-to-produce steel and arranged it in a way that defeated superior shells through pure geometry. It wasn't just a different design. It was a different way of thinking, a kind of brutalist efficiency that left the German engineers, with their pride in meticulous craftsmanship and material science, feeling profoundly outmaneuvered. With the armor's secret revealed, the team began the full mechanical dissection. The T-34 was stripped down, component by component, each part laid out on the workshop floor like the bones of some prehistoric beast. It was here, amidst the grease and steel, that the second, more profound shock emerged. This was the realization that the tank's design was not a series of independent features, but a single, coherent expression of a terrifyingly pragmatic philosophy of total war. /n/n The engine was Oberleutnant Bauer's domain. The rear engine deck was unbolted, and a crane lifted out the entire power pack, a V12 engine made of aluminum. Bauer's initial reaction was one of pure, unadulterated contempt. An aluminum diesel, he exclaimed, wiping his hands on a rag. It's a tractor engine. Look at the casting, the tolerances. It's an abomination. Compared to his beloved Maybach HL-120, a compact, high-revving, gasoline-powered marvel of precision engineering, the Soviet V2 diesel was a crude, noisy brute. It leaked oil. Its fuel injection was unsophisticated. It was, in his professional opinion, an insult to internal combustion. /n/n But Adler forced him to look deeper. France, stop thinking like a Maybach engineer and start thinking like a Russian general. Why diesel? Bauer began to list the disadvantages. Heavier, lower power-to-weight ratio, noisier. Now list the advantages, Adler prompted. Bauer paused. Well, diesel fuel is less flammable than gasoline. A non-penetrating hit is less likely to start a catastrophic fire. Exactly, Adler said. A significant boost to crew survivability. What else? The fuel is simpler to refine. It has better lubricity. And Adler pressed. And Bauer admitted reluctantly, it has the same logistical base as your transport trucks and tractors. One fuel for the entire army. The logistical simplicity is significant. Adler nodded. Now the aluminum block. Yes, aluminum is a strategic material, but it makes the engine far lighter than a cast iron equivalent, partially compensating for diesel's inherent weight. They have saved hundreds of kilograms, which can be put into armor or ammunition. It is not a tractor engine, France. It is a purpose-built strategic weapon. /N/N then came the suspension. Beneath the mud-caked road wheels, they found a Christie suspension system, licensed from an American designer in the 1930s. It featured large wheels and long travel coil springs, a system the German army had evaluated and rejected as being too complex and taking up too much internal hull space. But as they examined it in the context of the T-34, they understood its purpose. The wide tracks, combined with this long travel suspension, gave the tank phenomenal cross-country mobility, especially in the mud and snow of the East. "We build our tanks for the roads of France," Richter observed, a note of revelation in his voice. "They have built theirs for Russia. They have no roads." The flaw of lost internal space was a compromise they were willing to make for supreme operational mobility in their own territory. /N/N their debates grew more heated, echoing through the vast workshop late into the night. Every perceived flaw was re-examined through this new lens of ruthless pragmatism. The two-man turret was a clear and obvious tactical deficiency. The commander, who was also the gunner, was overworked. He could not effectively command the tank while also aiming and firing the main gun. It was a violation of a core tenet of German Panzer doctrine. "Why would they do this?" Bauer demanded. "It cripples the tank's fighting ability." Adler pointed to the turret ring, a massive, simple, sand-cast component. "Because a three-man turret requires a larger, more complex turret ring, a wider hull, and a more sophisticated design. A two-man turret is smaller, lighter, and crucially, faster to build. They have made a calculated decision to sacrifice tactical efficiency for production speed. They are willing to accept a less effective tank if it means they can have two of them, or even three, for every one of ours." /N/N it was a chilling thought. The German engineers, products of a culture that celebrated perfection and technological mastery, were dissecting a machine that was the embodiment of good enough. The rough welds didn't matter because they were strong enough. The poor interior ergonomics didn't matter because the crew's life expectancy was measured in weeks anyway. The lack of a radio in many early models didn't matter if the tanks were employed in crude, mass charges. In a long, impassioned monologue one evening, Adler synthesized their discoveries. "We have been looking at this vehicle as engineers," he said, gesturing to the disassembled tank. "That is our mistake. We must look at it as a weapons system, as a component of a larger national strategy. Every design choice that we, in our arrogance, have labeled as primitive or crude is, in fact, a stroke of brutal genius. They are not building a dueling weapon for a nightly contest on a summer field. They are forging a club, a simple, heavy, unbreakable club, and they intend to build millions of them and beat us to death with it. This tank. This is the philosophy of the Horde made metal." The room fell silent. In the sterile, orderly world of Kummersdorf, the chaotic, violent, and utterly alien logic of the Eastern Front had finally made itself understood. Having grasped the underlying philosophy, Adler's team began to analyze the T-34's weaknesses not as failures, but as calculated and accepted compromises. This shift in perspective was crucial. It moved the analysis from mere criticism to a deeper understanding of the enemy's doctrine and industrial limitations. They created a detailed debit and credit ledger, meticulously documenting every flaw and then hypothesizing the strategic advantage gained by its acceptance. /N/N, the transmission was a prime candidate for this analysis. Bauer, after stripping down the gearbox, was appalled. It was a simple four-speed crash box, a design fundamentally unchanged from the 1920s. It lacked synchromesh, making gear changes notoriously difficult and violent. Captured Soviet training manuals, translated with some difficulty, reportedly advised the driver to use a small sledgehammer, which was often issued with the tank, to force the gear lever into place. "This is not just a compromise, it's a catastrophe," Bauer argued. The driver must expend enormous physical effort. A moment's hesitation in changing gear during combat could be fatal. The stress on the drivetrain is immense. I'd wager these gearboxes have a terribly short service life. Adler did not disagree. Your assessment of the technical deficiency is correct, France. Now provide the strategic rationale. Bauer struggled for a moment, his engineering pride warring with the new logic. Finally, he spoke. It is simple, very few complex gear sets. It can be manufactured with relatively low-precision machine tools, the kind you might find in a locomotive works or a tractor factory. It does not require specialized gear-cutting masters. The service life is short, yes, but they have designed the entire rear plate to be removable. The whole power pack, engine and transmission, can be lifted out and replaced in a matter of hours in a field workshop. They are not repairing the component, they are replacing the entire module. The paradox was clear. A terrible piece of machinery from the crew's perspective was a masterpiece of logistical thinking. They had traded operator comfort and component longevity for ease of mass production and field maintenance. /N/N, they turned their attention to the optics and vision systems. German tanks were equipped with superb Zeiss optics. A Panzer commander had excellent all-round vision through his cupola's periscopes, allowing him to maintain situational awareness and command his vehicle and platoon effectively. The gunner had a clear, precise sight that allowed for accurate fire at long range. The T-34, by contrast, was notoriously blind. The driver had a single, narrow vision slit, often of poor-quality laminated glass that distorted the view. The commander gunner had a single, crude PT-47 periscopic sight that was difficult to use for observation and targeting simultaneously. There was no commander's cupola on this early model, only a single, forward-facing periscope and a rotating episcope on the turret roof. The crew is fighting from inside a steel coffin, Richter stated flatly. They can see almost nothing to their sides or rear. This explains why they are so vulnerable to our infantry with satchel charges. And yet, Adler countered, this single, simple sight can be produced by the thousands in a factory that might otherwise be making eyeglasses or binoculars for the infantry. The complex cupola on a Panzer IV requires high-grade optical glass, precision grinding, and the work of skilled craftsmen. How many of those simple Russian sights can be built for the cost and man-hours of one of our commander's cupolas? 10, 20. The Russian doctrine does not rely on a single tank commander outmaneuvering his opponent. It relies on a wave of 20 tanks, of which only one needs to see the target clearly. They were sacrificing the individual effectiveness of the unit for the overwhelming power of the mass. /N/, and even the interior layout, a source of initial scorn, was reevaluated. The ammunition for the main gun was stored in rectangular steel boxes on the floor of the fighting compartment. When these were opened, the sharp edges of the containers presented a constant hazard to the crew, and the loose rounds would clatter around during movement. The spent shell casings were simply ejected onto the floor, creating a treacherous, brass-littered surface for the loader to navigate. A recipe for disaster, Richter commented. In a prolonged engagement, the crew would be swimming in hot brass. Adler pointed to the design schematics. Look at the hull. It is a simple, welded box. There are no complex internal structures. These ammunition boxes are just that, boxes. They are cheap to make. They are dropped into place. The entire system is designed for speed of assembly. They have consciously sacrificed crew efficiency and safety for the ultimate goal of getting another chassis out of the factory door. The calculation was brutal and inhuman, but within the context of the Soviet Union's seemingly inexhaustible manpower reserves and its desperate struggle for survival, it was terrifyingly logical. Every weakness they identified pointed to the same conclusion. The T-34 was a weapon that had been ruthlessly optimized for a single purpose, to be produced in enormous, war-winning quantities by a nation under siege. In the final weeks of the analysis, Dr. Adler shifted the focus from the machine itself to the system that created it. He requested all available intelligence from foreign armies East, Fremd hier Ost, regarding Soviet industrial capacity, resource allocation, and labor practices. The documents, many of them sketchy and based on pre-war estimates, nonetheless painted a staggering picture that gave context to the dissected tank on their workshop floor. The T-34 was not merely a product of a design bureau, it was a perfect mirror of the entire Soviet military-industrial complex, and by extension, the state itself. /N Adler spread a large map of the Soviet Union across a table. Here is Kharkov, where this tank was likely built at the locomotive factory. Here is Stalingrad with its tractor factory. And here, he swept his hand east across the Ural Mountains, are Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, Nizhny Tagil. This is what we call Tankograd, Tank City. While our armies were advancing, they were putting their factories on trains and moving them 1,000 kilometers to the east, reassembling them in the middle of winter, often in open fields. The machine tools that built this T-34 are probably already running again, safe behind the Urals. The scale of this industrial migration was difficult for the German engineers, accustomed to their established, century-old industrial heartland in the Ruhr, to comprehend. It spoke of a level of centralized control and societal mobilization that was absolute. /N they began to quantify the difference. Using their detailed analysis of these components, they estimated the man-hours required for its production. The numbers were shocking. The extensive use of casting for complex parts like the turret, the minimal machining required on most surfaces, the simple, rugged components, and the design that favored welding over complex joinery all contributed to a dramatically lower production cost in terms of labor. Their most conservative estimate suggested that for the man-hours required to produce one Panzer IV, the Soviets could produce at least 2, and possibly 3, T-34s. When they factored in the more complex Tiger tank, then in its prototype stage, the ratio became closer to 1 to 10. "We are building wristwatches and they are building alarm clocks," Bauer said, the arrogance finally gone from his voice, replaced by a quiet sense of awe. /N this industrial reality was directly reflected in doctrine and crew training. The Wehrmacht's Panzerwaffe was an elite force. A German tanker underwent months, sometimes years, of intensive training. He was taught to maintain his complex machine, to use its superior optics to kill at range, to work as part of a finely tuned team. The T-34, by its very design, suggested a different approach. Its simplicity meant that a tractor driver or a factory worker could be taught the basics of its operation in a matter of weeks. The crude controls, unreliable transmission, and poor visibility were acceptable because the crew was considered as expendable and replaceable as the tank itself. The Soviet doctrine they were facing was not one of maneuver and finesse, but of attrition and mass. They would send waves of T-34s, poorly trained but numerous, to overwhelm the qualitatively superior but numerically inferior German Panzers. They would trade 3 of their tanks for one of ours, and consider it a victory, because they could always build more. /N the final synthesis was a stark and deeply troubling portrait of their enemy. Germany's war effort was predicated on a quality over quantity, Qualität über Quantität philosophy. It produced exquisite, technologically advanced weapons like the Panzer IV and later the Panther and Tiger. But each of these weapons was a masterpiece that required immense resources, skilled labor, and a sophisticated industrial base. The supply chain was long and vulnerable. The logistical needs were enormous. The Soviet Union, embodied by the T-34, represented the opposite. Quantity has a quality all its own. Adler summarized it in a stark paragraph he drafted for the final report. "While we are building one Tiger tank, a process involving hundreds of specialized subcontractors and requiring 300,000 man-hours, the enemy is building 20 T-34s. While we are organizing the complex rail transport for that single Tiger to the front, the enemy is training 100 peasants to crew their new tanks and driving them straight from the factory floor to the battle. While we debate the optimal alloy for a road wheel bearing, the enemy is casting 1,000 simple wheels from pot metal. We are fighting a craftsman's war, while they are fighting an industrialist's war. By every metric we can devise, our tank is superior. But by the only metric that matters, the ability to project sustainable armored force onto the battlefield, their system is superior. /N the T-34 on the workshop floor was no longer just a tank. It was a monument to a different reality. It was the physical manifestation of the vast steppes, the centralized, brutal state, the expendable masses, and the colossal, relocated industry of the Urals. It was a mirror reflecting a horrifying truth. Germany had picked a fight not with an army, but with an entire continent organized for total, attritional warfare. The report no one wanted to hear. Content: the late autumn air grew cold outside the Kummersdorf workshop. Inside, under the glare of industrial lamps, Dr. Adler and his team gathered for their final task: to distill their weeks of analysis, their shocking discoveries, and their grim conclusions into a formal report for the Waffenamt, and ultimately for the OKH. The atmosphere was somber. They were no longer just engineers evaluating a piece of enemy hardware. They felt like physicians who had diagnosed a terminal illness in their own nation. /N Adler dictated the summary, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, while a secretary typed rhythmically. He laid out the facts with clinical precision: the revolutionary effectiveness of sloped armor, the strategic genius of the V2 diesel engine, the surprising mobility of the Christie suspension, and the overarching design philosophy of radical simplification for mass production. He included the damning statistics, the production hour comparisons, the raw material requirements, the logistical simplicity. He detailed the numerous flaws: the cramped two-man turret, the abysmal crew ergonomics, the unreliable transmission, but framed them not as weaknesses but as accepted doctrinal compromises made in the service of overwhelming numerical superiority. The report was a masterpiece of technical analysis, but it read like a eulogy for the German way of war. /N then came the final section: recommendations. This was the most dangerous part. After a long debate, Adler, with the full backing of his chastened team, decided that anything less than the unvarnished, shocking truth would be a betrayal of their duty. He dictated the final, fateful paragraph: the PZ, KPFW, T-34 represents a paradigm shift in armored vehicle design and doctrine. Its primary virtues are not tactical, but strategic and industrial. It is the conclusion of this analysis team that all current medium tank development programs should be halted. The most strategically sound course of action, given the realities of a prolonged war of attrition on the Eastern Front, is to initiate an immediate, direct, and unaltered copy of the T-34 design, utilizing our own superior manufacturing techniques only where they do not impede the rate of production. /N he paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the cold air. To recommend that the master engineers of Germany, the heirs of Krupp and Daimler, should slavishly copy a primitive, Russian design was heresy of the highest order. It was an insult to national pride, to the party's ideology of technological supremacy, and to the powerful industrial interests of firms like Porsche, Henschel, and Mann. Adler knew the reaction this would provoke. He could already picture the faces of the generals and procurement officials in Berlin, a mixture of disbelief, indignation, and outright fury. They would see it as defeatism, as a failure of German spirit. The report would be read, stamped Geheim, secret, and quietly buried in a filing cabinet. /N, and that is precisely what happened. The Kummersdorf Memorandum, as it came to be known by the few who saw it, was received with outrage. Guderian, who had seen the T-34 in the field, supported its findings, but the political and industrial inertia was too great. The idea of mass-producing a Russian design was ideologically and politically impossible. The report was dismissed, but its ghost lingered. The truth, once seen, could not be entirely unseen. The findings of Adler's team did influence the next generation of German armor. The Panther tank, which would appear a year and a half later, was a direct, if unacknowledged, answer to the T-34. It incorporated sloped armor and an overlapping road wheel suspension for better cross-country performance. But it was a German answer. Instead of copying the T-34's simplicity, the engineers created a machine of immense complexity, a magnificent, powerful but over-engineered and unreliable predator that could never be produced in the numbers needed to turn the tide. It was the perfect fusion of the lessons and Germany's fatal addiction to perfection. /N/, the documentary narrative fades on a final imagined scene. Dr. Klaus Adler stands alone in the workshop late at night, long after the report has been sent. The dissected T-34 lies before him, its secrets laid bare. He places a hand on the cold, sloped glacis plate that had started it all. He had done his duty. He had uncovered the truth and reported it clearly to his superiors. The knowledge had been gained, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that it had been gained too late. The war, he now understood, would not be won by the nation with the best tanks, but by the nation with the best system for making tanks. In that quiet workshop, surrounded by the pieces of a crudely welded but strategically brilliant machine, Adler understood that the war on the Eastern Front was already lost, not in the mud of Rasputitsa or the snows of Stalingrad, but in the irreconcilable difference between two philosophies, a difference that was written, for anyone with the courage to read it, in steel.